when they got together to do the work, it was always to improve the music. It was always to improve the songs. It was always to improve the albums. And they worked collaboratively that way.
You can't argue with how good Hotel California is for what it sets out to be. That highly produced, perfectly, coiffed, manicured record.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums.
Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of the Eagles. Unlike many bands, the Eagles didn't grow up together. They didn't even come from the same corner of America. But in the late 1960s, their separate roads collided in the music circles of Los Angeles, and something unexpected took shape. What emerged was a band that would become the quintessential California sound, blending country, rock, harmony, and heartbreak at the exact moment America was ready for it. The Eagles helped define a new musical movement and then took it to unprecedented heights. Over the decades, they would sell more than 150 million albums, craft some of the most enduring songs in American music, and become one of the most successful bands in history. Here to discuss the Eagles are our two guests, Steve Caffarelli and Rick Forgo, authors of Up Ahead in the Distance. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Great to be here.
What was it about the Eagles that made you focus on them as your subjects for 2 coming on 3 books?
For me, it was really about the love of the music. I'm a fan, and their pursuit of musical excellence, and you mix that in with the business smarts that they had, and how they were constantly shifting and reinventing themselves in different ways. And once you find that story, it's kind of hard to let it go. It seemed like most of the Eagles books that were out there, they focused more on the drama and less on the artistry. So I wanted to drill down more deeply on their inspirations and how they worked together to take music that was good and evolve it into something great.
This is a band that's interesting. A lot of bands grow up in the same town and they get together in a garage and away they go. These guys are from all over the place, and I wondered if you could go back and tell us a little bit about the 4 original members: Glenn Frey, Don Henley on drums, Randy Meisner bass, Bernie Leadon guitar, where they came from, what kind of families they grew up in, just to give us a backdrop of who these guys are.
Well, I would say that Glenn Frey was, even today, if you ask Don Henley, he'll tell you that Glenn Frey was the leader of the band, even though they didn't really have a designated leader. And he hailed from the suburban area around Detroit. He was your typical high school kind of can't wait till I get out of here kind of guy, who took an interest in music. His mother forced him to take piano lessons for 8 years, so he was better situated to music than most of his musical contemporaries of the day, because he could actually read music. And he performed in a variety of bands around Detroit. He met Bob Seger there, who helped him early on. I think he had 3 or 4 bands there, and then he followed his girlfriend to Los Angeles. Henley was feisty in his own way, although he was, I guess, more quiet, more introspective, more brooding, and he hailed from East Texas in a little town called Leadon, and he got into music when his mother bought him his first drum set in his early teens, and he got his appreciation for music every week when his family would listen to the Louisiana Hayride, which introduced him to R&B and other types of music. And so he was brought up in an environment like that. His dad worked in an auto parts store, and his mom was a housewife. as he got into his older teens, he formed a band. You contrast that to Bernie Leadon, who was more of a free spirit. His family was military adjacent. His father worked for an aerospace company, and he traveled around the country. Bernie himself was born in Minneapolis. He and his family went to San Diego and then to Gainesville. And then from there, he found his way back to Los Angeles. But each one of those stops brought him into a different musical environment that he learned from. Randy Meisner was the quiet one of the bunch. He grew up in rural Nebraska, Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Grew up a big Elvis fan in a family that was poor, but encouraged his musical talent. All of these guys sort of ended up together.
While the band grew up in different regions of America, each of them made their way ultimately to Los Angeles to become part of the California scene that was emerging in the late 60s with the Laurel Canyon sound of Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Byrds, Joni Mitchell, and other LA bands like The Doors. Unlike Crosby, Stills and Nash, which was considered a supergroup of individuals who joined forces after each being in a successful band, the Eagles were not well known in their prior careers. They basically played in other groups with some limited success. For example, Glenn Frey played acoustic guitar and sang backup vocals on Bob Seger's Ramblin' Gamblin' Man. Meanwhile, Bernie Leadon had gone on with the Flying Burrito Brothers, one of the pioneers of what was to become country rock. He joined them for their second album and their third album, but left in 1971. The music club The Troubadour was a key place for performers to get their break in LA, and that's where Don Henley and Glenn Frey met, bringing together two individuals who would go on to become one of the most fruitful partnerships in rock history. In 1971, Linda Ronstadt hires Glenn Frey to be in his band, and Frey suggests that she also hire his friend drummer, Don Henley. Linda also hires bassist Randy Meisner in summer of 71. And in July, the future Eagles play together not as the Eagles, but simply as four musicians behind Linda Ronstadt. In 71, they tell Linda they're leaving, and she is supportive.
It was a pretty brief thing because pretty quickly, after they were assembled as that backing band, they realized that was something there that, we could maybe be our own band. We may have something to offer here. And to Linda's credit, and they always give her the credit, she gave them her blessing and didn't hold them back and said, yeah, you're a backing band now, but if you want to take a shot at being your own band, go. And from there, that became the start of the Eagles with the original four guys.
So ultimately, their first album, simply entitled Eagles, comes out of the gate. 3 memorable cuts. It contains the hit Take It Easy, which went to number 12 on the charts, was co-written by Jackson Browne. Witchy Woman went to number 9, written by Bernie Leadon and Don Henley. And Peaceful Easy Feeling at number 22, written by a friend of the band, Jack Tempchin. What are your thoughts on that first album? How was it received?
So I like it, and I don't necessarily think it's their strongest or most accomplished record, but there's an innocence about it that may have been lost on future records. Later, it became more of the Glenn and Don show as them as kind of the band leaders.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on that because we want to dive into that later. That's for sure.
It's a more balanced sort of thing. And originally, really, there was only one Don Henley song on the record, which seems unheard of. The fact that you had to make Don Henley almost a second thought speaks to what a different animal it was on that first record.
Yeah.
You jump to Hotel California and Don Henley sings the bulk of everything, which we'll talk about more later as well.
It's amazing how these bands that, they start in this collaborative effort, a lot of them. And then, of course, one or two strongmen emerge over time. And certainly that's the case here.
I don't think enough can be said about, where they were immersed in Laurel Canyon. I mean, Jackson Browne was living in the apartment above them. And, Glenn gets a co-credit with Take It Easy, But I think his contribution to the song was
The line about the Ford.
the Ford. Yeah. Oh my.
It's a girl, my lord, and a flatbed. Yeah.
Right. And that was his contribution. And, you ask Jackson Browne and he'll say, well, that's what made the song.
Yeah. So I think just to, kind of, put the dot on that, I think you look at those first three singles, the Jack Tempchin song was essentially a cover, although I'm sure they made it completely their own. Glenn heard where it needed to go and he brought it there. So whether he's just being polite and charitable and putting his ego aside or not, we'll never really know, but that's the hunch I get.
And I think that what they said, what Don said, Henley said, was that Glenn was known as the lone arranger. He was already at that time thinking of ways to take songs and make them better. And he did that throughout his entire career. So,
yeah. But there's a great line in the documentary, I think it's The Long Run, the documentary, where he talks about how he could hear the work and craftsmanship that Jackson Browne was putting into his songs, and he'd hear the tea kettle go off, and then Jackson Browne would shuffle off to the stove to get the tea ready and then back to the piano to work the chords out. I mean, and he realized right there the work ethic required to shape a song.
Exactly. That's what you need to do to write a song. That is it.
Garage to Stadiums, ranked as one of the top 5% of podcasts globally.
In 73, April, they released Desperado. It contains songs that would become staples of the catalog, Tequila Sunrise, Desperado. But this album didn't do as well commercially in its initial release period. What do you think that was about?
I think that the studio wanted another debut album. They wanted another album just like the debut with 2 or 3 hit singles and just something they could build on from before. I don't think they were looking for anything beyond that. They were just like studios do. They were looking to make money. And I think the band was sort of embracing their country rock visage. I think that Glenn Johns, their producer, liked it an awful lot, and the studio heads at Asylum were wondering why the hell they got this goddamn cowboy album. They didn't know how to market it, and they didn't know what to do with it because it wasn't really country and it wasn't really rock. It was something in between,
right?
And they never quite figured out how to market it.
So that's interesting, Rick, because Steve, you touched on it earlier. The influence for the Eagles sound for that first era. I mean, I guess you would have had the band, Flying Burrito Brothers, these kind of bands that sort of kicked that country off, the Byrds, etc. What would you say influenced their sound for that first era?
I would say you just named a couple of them, but definitely, the Byrds, the Burrito Brothers, Buffalo Springfield, and Bernie had played with the Burrito Brothers, and he had played with Gene Clark from the Byrds, and even the Burritos were a Byrd offshoot. Graham Parsons had briefly come from there, but certainly you got to talk about Poco. Poco was probably the biggest, example of like the people that made the blueprint for the Eagles, but they weren't successful, whereas the Eagles were. As for why that was. Just to backtrack for a minute, they'll be the first to admit that Poco was a big influence on them, and Poco knew it as well. Not only did they take their old bass player twice, because Timothy Schmidt played in Poco as well, but Richie Furay will tell stories about seeing those guys in the front row, checking them out, studying, learning.
In Richie's house. I went to Richie's house and watched them practice. Yeah.
Yeah. So Coco's like the technology company that got usurped by Microsoft that took their ideas and was a good
technology, actually. Yeah.
I mean, a huge Poco fan. So I give Poco all the credit in the world too, but the Eagles took the blueprint and kind of one-up them because they they learned from, part of it was timing. When the Eagles came along, it was a few years later than Poco. So, maybe they had a little more time to adjust to that. Is it country? Is it rock thing? But you got to give the Eagles credit that they decided this is what worked and this is what didn't work. So, for example, there's no full-time pedal steel player in the Eagles. They pull it out for one or two songs once in a while, but they didn't have a pedal steel player. Whereas the Burrito Brothers did, Poco did, they decided that's not going to work, and no, everybody's got to look great. Everybody's got to sing really well. They knew the importance of a great song and keeping your eye on the business sort of thing. So they had all those influences of those early country rock guys, and then they added their own spin to it and were successful.
What I was wondering was, do you think the geographic disparity in these guys, they all came from different corners of America, did that play a part in the sound that ultimately came forth?
I think it did, because you had Glenn from Detroit and sort of like that rock background, Don representing all the great country that came out of Texas. Both of those guys kind of like students of the American Songbook, all the classics and things like that. But then you had Bernie, who was actually very accomplished as a bluegrass player. They were leaning on, his skills as, mandolin, banjo, things like that. Randy kind of really dug like R&B and stuff like that. He had a real high voice, which did wonderful on the harmonies. When you put them all together and stir the pot, especially in those early days where people were able to exert influence and say, I'm Bernie and I'm having a song on this record called Early Bird, which features the banjo, or I'm going to have a long banjo playing at the end of Take It Easy. That eclectic mix made your first couple records.
For their third album, March 1974's On the Border, the Eagles initially brought in legendary producer Glyn Johns, a man whose resume read like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, The Who, Led Zeppelin, and the Kinks were some of his previous clients. The album delivered the band's first #1 single, Best of My Love. But partway through recording, the Eagles made a pivotal move, switching producers to chase a harder rock sound. Bill Simzik, a producer connected to their friend Joe Walsh, stepped in and helped shape the punchier hit Already Gone. On the Border also marked a turning point in the band's lineup, introducing Don Felder, a rock guitarist from Gainesville, Florida, and longtime friend of Bernie Leadon. Bill Simzik had just come off producing Joe Walsh's album, which contained the hit song Rocky Mountain Way. Simzik suggested they needed to add another guitar to toughen up their sound. Glenn Frey invites Don Felder to the studio to put down some slide guitar on the song, and the band is blown away by Felder's ability. Felder had come from the same town as Bernie Leadon and Tom Petty, which was Gainesville, Florida, and had made his way to the LA scene. They ask him to play that guitar solo to Already Gone, and they're impressed. Felder thinks this is just a session work, but it is actually an audition. Next day, Frey invites him to join the band. The hiring of Felder and the switch to Bill Simzik led to the transition of the Eagles from pure country rock towards more rock-oriented music.
Glyn Johns saw them understandably, as a great little harmony group, a little polite band of minstrels that make angelic sounds, not as rockers, And there's a famous story where Henley wanted his drums to sound more like John Bonham. And when Simzik came along, they said to him, well, will you mic the drums? How many mics do you put on? And of course he said, well, we put lots of mics on every drums. And they were very excited by that because they were looking to bring out more, rock and roll with their country.
And so, Steve, that first album with Felder in tow was June 75's One of These Nights. Contains Lion Eyes, Take It to the Limit. Did it deliver on that rock transition objective? Henley joked it was their satanic country rock period because it was a dark time politically and musically in America. And he thought,
yeah, and there's something to be, there's a missing part of that. So that was his first full record. He came in as a late addition. They explored a bunch of different sounds on that. One of these nights, the title track is not at all country rock. I mean, it's a rock song. It's mystical. It's dark, but it's not country.
But maybe just a little bit of disco themes going on in there.
Got some disco going on.
next, one of the founding members has philosophical differences around the direction of the music, and the band forges ahead in a new musical direction. Now we're moving into the Bernie Leadon being, I guess, marginalized, not happy. Why did he leave the band? I mean, was it as simple as the music direction, or what did your research tell you?
When you take a look at Bernie really was a free spirit. The Eagles were a business, and they made money, and they toured extensively, and they toured hard. Bernie was beginning to fray a little bit on the edges from all of the touring and the emerging presence or dominance of Don Henley and Glenn Frey, because they were taking up more space in the albums in terms of cuts that made it to the album and to the cuts that got released. And by the time he got to On the Border, they kind of reached a boiling point because Bernie at the time was dating Patty Davis, who was Ronald Reagan's stepdaughter. She co-wrote a song with Bernie called I Wish You Peace, and Bernie absolutely wanted it on the album, and none of the other members of the band wanted it there.
He didn't think it was up to the standards of the rest of the record.
There's a lot going on here at this point, and it's interesting. That's a great description of why Bernie left. And just as the LA scene earlier had featured a lot of tight-knit musicians, the band begins to hang out with Joe Walsh, the singer-guitarist who had done Rocky Mountain Way. He shared a manager with the Eagles, so the guys began to hang out, which would inevitably lead to Joe being asked to join the band. In 1976, Eagles' Their Greatest Hits was released without the band's input or approval. The record label rushed it out to cash in on the group's explosive momentum. Ironically, the album the Eagles didn't want became the one everyone else did, going on to become one of the best-selling albums in U.S. history and ranking among the top 3 or 4 bestsellers worldwide. Their Greatest Hits, 71 to 75, which I still think is in the top 5 probably in the U.S. ever of sales. And yet here they are transitioning to Joe Walsh to get even more of a rock sound. Give us a sense of who Joe Walsh was and where he came from.
So, Joe Walsh was already an established act and a successful one. So that is one of the things that made it kind of curious. And a lot of people didn't particularly think that this was a good fit. Like, wait, Joe Walsh is joining the Eagles, the Take It Easy guys, and there's the guy who, Funk 49, and he wanted to be in a band. So it's almost understandable that he'd want to join the Eagles, besides the obvious financial boost. But he was a band guy more than people probably give him credit for.
And when you talk about Walsh and how in the world would he ever end up aligning with the Eagles? Well, they shared the same manager. Irving Azoff was the manager for both of them.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And
I believe Bill Simzik too, right? Came from the Walsh.
That's right. Because Bill Simzik was the producer who got the James Gang rolling.
With the departure of Bernie Leadon, friend of the band, Joe Walsh joins as a second guitarist, as the Eagles are intent on pursuing that harder rock-oriented sound. Their next release, Hotel California, would go on to become one of the best-selling albums of all time. When that release came out, I mean, that was monumental, obviously, that album. It's in the top 5 ever still. December 76, it had New Kid in Town, went to number 1. Hotel California went to number 1. And Life in the Fast Lane, I think, reached number 11. And then they had this interesting song, The Last Resort, about the plight of Native Americans after the push of white people across America. Some interesting stuff, but man, this is the quintessential, Steve, you said it, like it just gets better and better in terms of fame here. This album was everywhere.
Yeah, it was huge. And the funny thing about it is it's so highly produced, and in some ways it represents everything different than, say, what I love about Desperado, which might be my favorite record. But you can't argue with how good Hotel California is for what it sets out to be, for that highly produced, perfectly, coiffed, manicured record with not a single thing left to chance. And whether you find that appealing or not, some people don't, but it was successful in doing that. Whether you like it or not, it was wonderfully successful in accomplishing all that they intended it to be. And it's by this point that Henley's really, really taking center stage, where at this point, Glenn Frey's only singing one song on an Eagles record, which is almost unheard of, but it also speaks to how Glenn was the ultimate kind of,
team player,
company guy. What's good for the Eagles. He considered, I think they all had fantastic voices, including Glenn himself, but he thought of Don as the golden throat. I think that's not a phrase I made up. That's something he said. And, when it came time to say who's the best one to sing all these songs on the record, even, if it means less singing for the rest of us, he pushed for Don.
Everyone recognizes that riff of Hotel California. You guys had an interesting story about how that song evolved. You want to tell it?
Well, it started out with a demo that Felder had made, and he made a bunch of different demos of not completed songs necessarily, but licks and ideas and thoughts and so on. And he put them on a cassette tape, and he sent the cassette tape to the guys and said, anything you hear on this that maybe you think we could use. And, the vast majority of it was probably 15 or 16 songs. The vast majority of it they passed by, but Henley seemed intrigued by what he called a raga, like that one that's kind of like a Mexican raga thing. And then so that was basically the lick in the intro to Hotel California.
He left those tapes at his house in Malibu. They got together and they started riffing in the studio, and Henley was like, no, stop. It can't be that. It has to be exactly like it was in the demo. Exactly. And Felder had forgotten what it even was. Henley wanted it exactly that way. So he called, and the only one at his house was the maid, and he had the maid fish through all the tapes that were there, and she played it to him over the phone. That entire song in the studio was a labor of love. It took weeks and weeks to get that to get it down to exactly where they wanted. And it wasn't just Simzik, Felder, and Walsh in there deciding how all of that fit together. Henley was in there and Frey was in there, and they all had input on how every single lick went down. So, and Simzik called it the masterpiece of his career.
Wow. That's saying something. Tell us, I'm going to give you a quiz here. 10 words or less. I want you to describe the personalities of Glenn Frey, Don Henley, Bernie Leadon, Joe Walsh, Randy Meisner, and Don Felder. I know that's a lot of people, but what I want to set up for is, you guys touched at the beginning, this band is full of drama, because we want to touch on, some of the stuff that hits the fan here. Tell us about Glenn Frey, 10 words or less. Throw any words you want out, and then we're going to go to Don Henley.
I'd say Glenn is mercurial,
boundless energy, extroverted,
tough,
business-minded,
and collaborative.
and rock and roll lifestyle.
Okay. Don Henley.
Brooding, perfectionist, lyricist.
Little anal retentive, little high-strung, immensely talented, underrated for his drumming contributions, rightly rated for his gravelly, soulful voice.
And his songwriting abilities were great. Felder wrote all the music for Hotel California, but it didn't have that cultural pop until Frey and mostly Henley built that aura around it with the lyrics.
Bernie Leadon. Let's go to him next since he was an original.
Bernie was a lower key guy. He wanted to go surfing. He wanted to go to the beach. Wanted to play some tunes.
He wanted to be chill. And when they decided to keep going back on the road and back on the road and back on the road, he was like, we ought to take a little time and just relax and not drive so hard because we're going to kill each other if we don't. And ultimately, he ended up being right. They would have lasted a lot longer if they had taken a break.
Let's go to Randy Meisner next.
Shy, introverted, small town from an area called Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Real sort of small town type of guy. Even in his older years, he loved just hanging out and growing tomatoes.
Vulnerable,
not a real hardcore rock and roll guy. Sweet guy.
He always went with the flow. He wanted to be a good bandmate.
Didn't like the spotlight.
Right. And Don Felder.
Accomplished. He was an accomplished player, dedicated, ambitious musician, and skilled fretsman. They used to call him Fingers back in the day for his.
He's as a technical guitarist goes, just excellent and versatile, like very few guitarists of that day were. I mean, he could play it all. And putting him and Walsh together was just ended up being a great musical mix.
Let's touch on Walsh and then we're going to move on.
Talented guy, band leader type of capability, even though he wasn't a band leader in the Eagles per se. Funny, humorous. He brought an element of humor to the band that was, say, completely contraindicated compared to, say, like Henley, who people would probably accuse of being more humorless and serious and brooding. Alcohol, he struggled with alcohol a lot in his life, and you can't really leave that out because that kind of informed his personality as well. He was kind of that good time, pour me a drink and let's have a laugh kind of guy.
But a musical sponge, because he could play every lick that Eric Clapton ever played. He could play every lick that you name the blues guitarist, and he could play their licks, and he could play them from memory. And just a great guitarist. And if you've ever looked at the size of his hands, just has huge hands. It's no wonder he could play some of the things he could play because
wow,
farther than anyone else.
In 1977, bassist Randy Meisner leaves the band after an interesting confrontation. Can you give the audience some insight on what happened here?
So, as we said before, Randy was a very shy guy. He didn't like the spotlight. He really wasn't an alpha male kind of guy. And he had always sung live with the band. He'd always get a song or two in the early days. He'd be singing a song like, Midnight Flyer or, Keep on Trying off the first record, Trying. But by the time they got to one of these nights, Take It to the Limit, hit big. So that became his signature song. That's a Randy song. That's him singing the lead on that. And at the end of the song, there's a very high note that he hits. And every time he hits it, the crowd goes absolutely crazy. It's the highlight of the evening. Everybody wants that. He's reluctant to it. He's nervous that he's not going to hit it every night. He doesn't want to do it. And one particular night, he was saying, I've got the flu. I'm sick. I'm under the weather. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it. And Glenn, ever the kind of band leader, practical businessman, says, you can't let these people down. Go out and do it. You have to suck it up and do it and whatever. And they end up getting in a fight about that. And then there's an encore later that he doesn't want to go out for. And then at that point, after the show, they, I believe, come to blows. A few punches are thrown, and he didn't leave the band that night, but that was the night that he decided, I will leave the band after the end of the tour.
Next, interband tensions rise, amplified by drug use, as the Eagles begin their next album.
Want more Garage to Stadiums? Check out GarageToStadiums.com for official playlists, concert footage, and other interesting facts for each episode.
We're getting to kind of the end of the story here. The Eagles' next studio album, 1979's The Long Run, is being recorded. And it sounds like tensions are rising again. There's some drug use. Maybe you guys can give us some insights of the feelings between band members at that time and the challenges surrounding the band and that album.
Well, yeah, they were so stressed out about, we mentioned how they topped these uber successful one of these nights with Hotel California. How are they going to top that? And ultimately they didn't, although by any other band's measure, that was a hugely successful record, just not as big as Hotel California was. They were all absolutely fried. Spending all the time together with the diverse personalities didn't help. All the money, all the substances, things like that. None of that helped.
The Eagles also faced a music industry that by the end of the 1970s had gone through a dramatic transition. The Clash and the Sex Pistols had, by the mid-70s, driven a spike through the excesses of rock and roll with a stripped-down punk sound. And as we discussed in our Story of David Bowie episode, Bowie's albums Low and Heroes, both released in 1977, began to influence a new wave movement that would pave the way for new bands like the Talking Heads, Blondie, and the Cars.
You could point to kind of changing times. There were different things going on musically at the time. Country rock and even 70s rock as a whole was starting to fizzle. Yeah. There's starting to be evidence that new things are coming. It's almost the 1980s here. We're in 1979.
Well, you actually mentioned it earlier. You said that slickly produced Hotel California, the punk and new wave was almost a backlash against that idea.
Right. The Long Run was still slickly produced in a different sort of way. I think it's not as strong a record as, I think it's the worst of their classic six, in my opinion. But
I think when you look at the input for it, Glenn took a decided step backwards when it came time to develop that album, and you could tell because the strong cuts that Don contributed, you didn't see that coming from Glenn. They were burnt out. They didn't like each other anymore. They didn't want to hang out with each other anymore. And honestly, Bob Seger once said that the reason for the Eagles' breakup could be surmised in two words: Hotel California.
Bands and rock and roll bands are finite beasts. They have a peak, and then ultimately people, it's like a 4 or 5 way marriage,
Yeah.
That's hard to make work, and times were changing. They all wanted to kind of probably ultimately try solo careers in the 80s, and they did.
The album The Long Run is finally released in September 1979 and is somewhat of an uneven record, but does contain 3 very big tracks, including Heartache Tonight, which went to number 1 and was co-written by Glenn Frey's old Detroit friend, Bob Seger. Another key song was The Long Run, which went to number 8 on the singles chart, and I Can't Tell You Why, also peaking at number 8. However, This would be the last studio album as the band's tensions boiled over, with even longtime strongmen of the band, Frey and Henley, at odds with each other. Next, a concert in California turns into a flashpoint for this band as two band members threaten each other with violence on stage.
Enjoying Garage to Stadiums? Check us out on your favorite socials: Instagram, YouTube, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
There was the 1980, they had a Long Beach, California incident on stage. I mean, that's well documented in the documentary about the Eagles, but Glenn Frey and Don Felder go at it this time.
They finally had it. I mean, that what was bubbling underneath there was a benefit concert in Santa Monica, and they had earlier in the day they had met with Senator Cranston and his wife, and that's who the benefit was for. And as Mrs. Cranston was making her way through the band, and thanking them for the concert, they got to Felder, and she thanked Felder, and he said, "You're welcome," I guess.
Yeah, under his breath.
Frey just found that disrespectful, and he thought it hurt the brand. It hurt the Eagles brand to do that, and that's kind of what set everything off for what they called Long Night on Wrong Beach.
Because it was at Long Beach, yeah. And so they basically threatened to kick each other's ass on, once they got off stage, I guess.
All night long throughout the entire set.
Yeah, I mean, there's sometimes question about, why Frey seems to be the one having the confrontations. It was he who got a beer poured over his head by Bernie Leadon. It was he who had the spat with Meisner, and it was he who had the onstage spat with Felder. I think it again speaks to the idea, the role Frey played in the band outside of musically, of course. If it was a job, he was management. He was them in the us and them. And I think some of the other guys felt like, he's the boss, and he could be a pain in the ass and try to get his way. And that's evident if you hear the overleaked argument where, he says something to Felder like, I've been carrying your butt for 7 years or something, speaking like a boss school-marming one of the employees. Again, not to speak disparagingly about Frey, maybe there was a need for someone to be the heavy in the band.
And ultimately, I think that's what it was, because there wasn't anybody else in that band who was going to help move them forward. And sometimes these are intractable personalities that are that want to do what they want to do, and to move them forward, you have to have somebody in the band who's willing to be the bad guy. And that
gets us. That's a great segue to the two large personalities in the band. You've got in the Stones, Jagger, Richards, Beatles, Lennon, McCartney. It's fascinating to consider the evolution of how the two members in those two cases come to the fore. Even though in Jagger, Richards' case, they didn't even start the band. But how would you describe the relationship between Glenn Frey and Henley from beginning to end? Because what's interesting is on that Desperado album, Steve, that you like so much, Tequila, Sunrise, and Desperado was the first time they kind of came together as songwriters, but it almost foretold these guys taking control. And I'm interested to see how their relationship evolved over time as they took control, their own with each other.
Yeah, and that what you just mentioned, taking control on that second record was a conscious effort. They actually had a discussion among themselves and said, "Hey, look, you and we're going to have to steer this ship." So that was the first erosion of sort of like democracy, pure democracy. And I think their relationship was very good through most of the band, even though by the end, everyone was hating everyone. I think they needed each other. I think they both had the same goals and the same aspirations and the same vision for the band. But Henley was a little bit more passive aggressive with his stuff, more of a bookish. He was an English major. He was a thinker. He was a a little bit more reclusive in that way. It's just kind of tuned into his art. Whereas Frey, he was all those things, but he was extroverted. He had a big mouth and a big laugh, and he'd walk into a room and make it, take all the energy. And I think it was both those personalities were needed to co-run the band and get it to where it needed to be and where it ultimately went. But by the end, that's a lot of personality on each side of those respective men to put up with. Not everybody's easy to live with, and by the end they needed a break and they were done.
From beginning to end, though, when they got together to do the work, it was always to improve the music. It was always to improve the songs. It was always to improve the albums. And they worked collaboratively that way.
On July 31st, 1980, Glenn Frey says he is done with the Eagles. The legacy here of this band, I mean, this is probably one of the American bands ever, that's for sure. What's the Eagles' place in history? What do you think they'll be remembered for? And then the second part of that is who they influenced. So let's start with their place in history.
I think they are the quintessential American band. If you take a look at the Billboard chart, the Billboard rankings for albums, they're number 1 and they're number 3.
Yep.
Greatest Hits and Hotel California are up there, and they've been there.
That's incredible, isn't it?
It's just amazing. And I think the reason that happens is because whenever there's whenever new media comes around, whether it was vinyl or 8-track or cassette or CD or DVD or streaming, whatever it was, the people who bought them came back to buy them again,
right,
over and over and over. And when it wore out, they would buy another one. And I think that's what's kept them alive. But I think that the legacy that they bring is the perfectionism in the songs, and being able to tie that level of perfectionism with that level of emotional experience.
One thing I think they don't get enough credit for is the level of artistry that they brought to the songwriting and the production and stuff like that, because we know the songs are successful and such, and made them a lot of money and are well known, and some people equate that with them being, commercial sellouts or whatever, but I don't necessarily agree. I don't really think they sold out. I think they did exactly what they wanted to do, and I think they did it really well. They didn't compromise the artistry to get that money, in my opinion.
Who did they influence, do you think?
Oh, certainly the country rock, or the country band.
Today's country. Yeah. I mean, there's a reason Vince Gill's playing with them. And you take a look at the bands that are out there now. In fact, the reason they got back together was because country music of the late 1990s recognized that they were important to their evolution. When Travis Tritt came together for Common Threads, covered "Take It Easy."
I was just going to say, I would also think they influence anybody who has a strong eye and ear on harmony singing. The Beatles kind of got that going with the 2-part harmony, and everybody was influenced by that. And then occasionally they'd have the 3-part, like This Boy or Paperback Writer. But the Eagles kind of took what the Beach Boys were doing as well. That really rich layered 3 and 4-part harmony. And it did it really well. And that's the sound now. When I think of recording things and I do oohs and ahs, the blueprint is kind of like what the Eagles did so well.
And I think it's really cool that a band that built itself on its harmonies, when they finally broke up, the final song that got released as a new single for them was Seven Bridges Road, which the harmonies in that are just off the chart. I mean,
it's almost a cappella, a little bit of guitar, but the rest is just those guys singing. It was recorded in parts of 76 and 79.
Brilliant harmonies on that.
Today, we've been talking to Rick Forgo and Steve Caffarelli, authors of Eagles, Up Ahead in the Distance. You've really illuminated us on the Eagles story, the challenges, the trials, tribulations, but most importantly, some memorable music and an evolution of sound that remains on the charts, as you both said.
Well, we appreciate you having us.